I'll lecture today on El Salvador, a country of some 6.5 million people in Central America. I think there's a lot of confusion, not just on the left, but across the US. Certainly not in the Salvadorian community, or maybe there's confusion there as well. Maybe that's where the greatest confusion is. But in terms of understanding Bukele, to frame it in arroz con habichuelas, is Bukele good or bad? I asked you all for your opinion at the beginning of the class, and there were different viewpoints. I think what we see, and this is one of my pet peeves as an educator, we can't oversimplify things. Certain people want to go back to the Chinese Revolution, one of the most world-shaking historic events, and they want to say, this person was bad, this person was good. In the Russian Revolution, it's 10 times worse. And I think what we have to look at is contradictions and dialectics and actually gather evidence. So in this lecture today, I want to cover the balance sheet. Who is Bukele? What has he done for El Salvador? So when we talk about El Salvador was consistently the country with the leading murder rate in the entire world. Through 2015, before that, when we talk about El Salvador, a lot of people will remember las maras, las pandillas, the gangs. Mara Salvatrucha, which is MS-13, El Barrio 18. Very different, but some similarity to the rivalry that we saw in the 1980s and 90s, and to some extent to this day, between the Crips and the Bloods. In the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, o Comando Vermelho, o Terceiro Comando, and now the milícias. So when Bukele became president of El Salvador, or dictator, depending on your point of view, in 2019, he was on this holy mission to eradicate the gangs in crime, which sounds very good. Who could disagree with that, right, so far? I entitled the lecture, and I'll say it in English and Spanish, El Salvador Bukele, the wannabe messiah, the hunter of the poor, defender of oligarchs, el que se cree mesía, el cazador de los pobres, el defensor de los oligarcas. And that reflects my anti-imperialist point of view as I have sorted through what I'll call the Bukele phenomenon. I heard different sociologists saying that the Bukele phenomenon is a singularidad histórica. It's something we've never seen before. I don't know if I'd go that far, but even newspapers in Peru have front pages that say, we need a Bukele. Because Bukele has become this generation's Pinochet, the butcher of Santiago de Chile. The Bukele has become this generation, to use a New York City from here in the Bronx reference, Rudolph Giuliani. Y'all are probably too young to remember the 1980s, but Giuliani's whole thing in oppressed communities and even down on 42nd Street was to go after anybody who was homeless, who was trying to quote unquote panhandle or survive in the streets. He went after the quote unquote squeegee men. Again, y'all are too young, but back in the day, you stopped at the stoplight. This happens a lot now in La Ciudad de Mexico or in Santo Domingo. You stop at a stoplight, and someone comes up and tries to wash your windshield wipers to get a little solidarity or handout. So Bukele has framed himself in this type of Giuliani way, in this type of Pinochet way, and right in the national context of El Salvador, of Guatemala, there's this long history in Central America of the caudillos, of the strongmen, of the wannabe messiahs who always repress the student movement, the women's movement, the campesino or peasant movements, the workers' trade unions. And I think Bukele, in a sense, builds on this legacy of these dictadores or caudillos. The facts, though, are that Bukele and his all-out police state, there's been an estado de excepción for 1 year now in El Salvador. What Bukele did last year in March, I believe, he said there's martial law, there's a state of emergency. And he mobilized the full force of the state of El Salvador, all the police, all the military, all branches of the state. He mobilized them. He suspended all constitutional guarantees. the whole innocent before proven guilty, a just motive for the police to come into your neighborhood and arrest you. And what Bukele has overseen is an all-out assault on the working class neighborhoods and districts of El Salvador, what we would call here the hood, the ghettos, the most oppressed communities. So my argument is that Bukele has scapegoated the poor, has scapegoated these gangs, but I don't want to sugarcoat over the gangs. But has Bukele done anything to actually touch the very historical structures, the economic machinery that marginalized so many young people and forced them into joining gangs? Which brings up an interesting debate, right? Why do our young people, and in El Salvador, I don't think it's just young people, I think it's multi-generational, but why would they join Majas? What are the historical motivations? So to begin to understand the Bukele phenomenon, we have to really start in history. We have to go back to centuries of colonialism, where Central America is positioned by the Spanish Empire and then by the burgeoning US Empire as the banana republics, as the monocultivos, the monoculture economies where you only produce coffee, or you only produce this or that product, but that leaves the people historically dependent. And one of the top ways that money enters into El Salvador today is remesas. Remesas are remittances, all the money that Salvadorians send back, primarily from Los Angeles, Southern California, the DC, Washington, DC metropolitan area, and wherever Salvadorians have been forced to migrate. Special emphasis on forced migration. It wasn't that hundreds of thousands of Salvadorians in the 1980s and to this day in 2023 left their country voluntarily. And we have to begin to dissect this civil war in the 1980s, which was an internationalized civil war, which was a US proxy war against really the big three of Central America, if you will. Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, all had social revolutions, all had well-organized revolutionary people's armies, guerrilla armies, fighting for socialism, fighting for sovereignty, fighting for a new way against US neocolonialism. Because of the Vietnam syndrome, Ronald Reagan cannot pass through US Congress, direct US taxpayer money being used for this war. Like today, so far, 150 billion of our dollars from our pockets has gone to this war in Ukraine. An internationalized proxy war against Russia, using the Ukrainian everyday families, everyday humble people trapped in the middle of this great power struggle, a new Cold War, an ongoing global class struggle, if you will. So that's what happened to El Salvador, with the US showering millions and millions of dollars in arms to fund right-wing death squads. It's sad that tens of thousands of Salvadorians were killed, but the US media probably took the most notice when some nuns from Maryland, I believe, the Maryknoll nuns, were also, so these were religious missionaries doing all types of positive work, not your typical missionaries. These missionaries came out of what's called popular education, Paulo Freire, liberation theology, the fusion of an anti-imperialist perspective using the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, fused with political conscientización, political consciousness, right? And that's why Oscar Romero, this famous priest, is murdered in El Salvador in the early 1980s. So that's the context for the rise of these gangs. Well, how did the gangs arise? When you have a war, it displaces people. And the displacement forced tens of thousands of Salvadorian families to migrate to Mexico, to other countries, but primarily to Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, you have these Salvadorian youth coming of age in the 1980s and the 1990s, alienated, marginalized from the educational system, from all of the superstructure of society, forced to survive como ellos pueden, sálvanse si pueden, save yourself if you can, and you have the rise of these different gangs. Because what are gangs but parallel societies? Gangs are the love you never received at home because your parents were working double shifts, 2 jobs, or your father wasn't present, or your father was murdered in the war because he stood up for his campo, his land. So it's this horrific war in Central America that indirectly or directly generates this war in the streets of South Central Los Angeles, throughout the Los Angeles area, as well as up in San Francisco and in the Bay Area. This is the epicenter of where the Salvadorian gangs take shape. Fast forward 1990s, what does the US government do in the Clinton years? They crack down, quote unquote, on crime and on gangs. Iron fist, similar to Bukele. They take all these gang members, and what do? Deport them all back to San Salvador, to Soyapango, to a super repressed country that has been so thoroughly looted and has gone through this horrific genocidal proxy war. So those gangs, with all the experience from LA, Spanish is maybe not even their first language, they're suddenly back in El Salvador. And they set up shop. At the risk of oversimplification, Mara Salvatrucha, Barrio 18, they take over big chunks of this small Central American country. So Bukele was the mayor of San Salvador for a time. He splits with the party he was a part of, forms a new party called the Partido Nuevas Ideas. Bukele is only 41 years old, very, very, I was gonna say consistent. He's a braggart. He's always on social media. He positions himself as this messiah, as the savior of El Salvador. No pun intended with the wordplay. This is where Bukele comes from. So I think the big question then is Bukele popular today? And I think this is where it gets dialectical and multi-layered. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. Every survey that I've seen, todas las encuestas in the past few months, says Bukele's approval rate is, some say 75%, 72%, 82%. I've seen as high as 90 and 92%, which is something that he constantly brags about on his Twitter and TikTok. What is the reality on the ground? You all have probably seen the images of Bukele and the military and police raids into the everyday barrios of San Salvador and across the country. Right now they say that one study that just came out this week, 2,500 Salvadorian youth, just because they live in a poor neighborhood, have been arbitrarily detained, they've been locked up, they disappeared. Another few thousand are on the run, they can't sleep at home, they have to switch up neighborhoods every night. So if you look a certain way, basically if you look like anyone, as I look out onto you, if you look like any one of you, you could be a suspect. If you wear certain clothes, if you have to go home at night to certain neighborhoods. So there's all types of human rights violations. Bukele has been at war with other branches of the Salvadorian quote-unquote justice system. It's against the Constitution for him to run again. He's already saying that he wants to be dictator or president again. So it's kind of a sweeping overview in El Salvador of this current moment. A little more to weigh in on each side. I think this is me getting reports from friends, from professors who travel back and forth, from Salvadorians. I haven't been in El Salvador since I was teaching in Central America a number of years back. But Uber drivers, a lot of Uber drivers are going to tell you Bukele is great. I can finally drive my Uber anywhere in the country. I can finally drive at any time of the night and not be afraid. Whereas before, and it's similar in Rio de Janeiro, you drive that Uber into the wrong neighborhood, you don't know people, you got the wrong person with you, it could be lights out for you. So extortion was an everyday reality in these neighborhoods where the gang members could come and demand from any business, give us 50% of your income from last week. I doubt it was that diplomatic. It was another form of highway robbery, horizontal violence, internalized violence, everything that Frantz Fanon wrote about in The Wretched of the Earth, black skin, white masks, right? But Bukele never touches the underlying political economic structures that force young people into gangs because there's no dignified jobs available. But from the perspective of market people who are getting extorted, they started carrying out their own citizens' arrests. They were sick of being harassed by the gang members and robbed. And so they started almost forming another branch of the state, if you will, seizing these gang members and trying to hold them on some occasions until the police came. A Salvadorian woman recently, and this is part of Bukele's propaganda campaign, every Salvadorian can now return home in peace. And to contrast that with other countries, like what diaspora, what Haitians right now, Haitian Americans feel comfortable going back to Haiti. And to ask that question for your homelands, whether you're Colombian or Puerto Rican and all the different nationalities represented here. So at the same time, these very police forces have gone after the vendedores, the everyday people, just like the NYPD. I was looking at a report from a woman in Jackson Heights who sells tamales. She's been locked up 18 times by the NYPD. But every time she comes out of Rikers in central booking, what does she do? She goes back to selling her tamales because she has to survive. So I think the essence of Bukele is the same as the essence of the NYPD. Cazadores de los pobres, defensores de los ricos. So for me, the sociological conclusion is that Bukele is a punk. It's easy to stigmatize the poor. It's easy to lock up poor people. And then he shows these little sound bites of all these prisoners in these massive new detention centers that could be millions and millions and tens of millions of dollars that could be invested in these communities to create true educational opportunities so that people don't have to migrate, to create true dignified job opportunities so people don't have to join the gangs. Bukele has turned his back on social investment. He just announced his big campaign this week is high-tech firms come to El Salvador, no taxes. This will be a tax haven. We'll give you all the benefits, but where are the benefits for the everyday 6.5 million people of El Salvador? So I think Bukele represents that class dividing line where for many, they see him as a certain type of prophet or representative of their interests. I think the Salvadorian people, the nation, and the diaspora is very divided on these questions. So that's an overview of Bukele, of the certain controversies with the Bukele phenomenon, certainly coming from the left. There's a city council, Claudio Ortiz, a diputada, who I follow on Twitter. There's the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí de Liberación Nacional, that was the revolutionary anti-imperialist guerrilla organization that was then in state power. We should look at their record. We should look at the leadership now and where the anti-imperialists, where the class-conscious community organizations are, because that's another thing. Any trade unionists, any workers' reps who stood up to defend their communities, they've also been thrown into jail. And what do you see within these massive jails? You see a Salvadorian youth, almost naked, barefoot, woken up at any time, all types of different psychological torture methods, and then they cram them onto these buses, they move them all around. So again, it's this humiliation of the poor, and I'm not trying to in any way pass over or glorify what it's like to have gangs in your neighborhood, but it's like the new extortionists are the police who can come in and shut down these local market people. So that's why I drew this sociological conclusion.